lecture series. My name is Patricia Young. I'm the program manager for the Institute, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Amy Verdun, who will be talking on the geopolitics of the European Union's single market for financial services. I am particularly delighted to welcome Professor Verdun here today because she was my early mentor on European studies when I was an undergraduate at the University of Victoria. And she had recently moved to Canada from Europe at that time to start a program in European studies. I was instantly drawn to Amy's dynamism and enthusiasm for teaching and discussing European Union politics and political economy. And I got my first student grant to do research in Brussels through Amy's European Union initiative. So it feels so good more than 20 years later to be able to invite Amy to talk at Cornell's Institute for European Studies. Amy Verdun has been professor of political science and the founding director of the European Studies program at the University of Victoria since 1997. With only a short break or leave, actually, right? 2018 to 2020, when she served as professor of European politics and political economy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She earned her PhD in political and social sciences from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and she has also taught at the University of Essex in the UK. In July 2017, she was awarded the first Distinguished Lansdowne Fellow of the Faculty of Social Sciences, a position given to an established researcher in recognition of outstanding internationally recognized contributions to scholarship in their area of expertise. Amy's contributions to scholarship on the EU have indeed been outstanding, including over 100 publications in scholarly journals, such as Acta Politica, European Union Politics, International Studies Review, Journal of Common Market Studies, Review of International Political Economy, and World Politics. Amy has also written, edited, and co-edited numerous books, too many to mention them all here. So here is a selection that gives you some idea of the research interest, starting with this one, Economic and Monetary Union at 20, a stock taking of the tumultuous decade. Let's see. A few others. European Union governance and policy making, the Canadian perspective, ruling Europe, the politics of the Stability and Growth Pact, Britain and Canada and their large neighboring monetary unions, the European Union in the wake of Eastern enlargement, and European responses to globalization and financial market integration. Professor Verdun has also given a lot of service to the discipline of European studies. She was co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies and served in various capacities in many professional associations, such as the European Consortium for Political Research, the US-based European Union Studies Association, the International Political Science Association, and since 2018, she has been the chair of the Dutch Political Science Association. So please join me in giving a welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia, for inviting me out. I feel very honored, and it's delighted to see that if you invest in students, that may one day it come back to you. So thank you very much for your willingness to pay it forward, so to say. So thank you very much. Also, thanks for all of you for coming out. It's always a busy time of year in February when students are doing all their exams, and also when the roads are icy, and they may be later today, I understand. Okay, when Patricia and I were talking about the possible topic, I offered a few, and she said this is the most interesting for our audience at this point in time. And I was very grateful that she chose this topic, because in fact, I chose two topics that I was much further advanced. And then this topic, which in fact, I've only presented once before. So it's a work in progress, and the paper hasn't even been sent to the journal yet. So if you have comments, this is an excellent time to get your feedback into the paper. So before I start with my proper presentation, and I have some PowerPoint slides that will guide me through my talk, which I understand will be about 40 minutes roughly. I wanted to acknowledge that I do this work together with Lucia Quaglia from Bologna University. And we have just been showing nice books. And in the honor of her absence, maybe I'll also do a little bit of publicity for her. So Lucia Quaglia has written this book on the European Union and global financial regulation, which is an outstanding book that looks in particular at one of the cases I will describe in a minute. Although the book was done just after the end of the financial crisis. So it's in a sense dated, and the work that is presented today builds on that work. But I thought because she can't be here, I thought I'd honor her in this way. So honoring also my co-author in the paper that is behind this presentation. Anyone who would like to read the paper is also welcome to ask Patricia. I can send a copy if you're interested in the actual article length paper. The work is supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and that has provided us with the research time we need to do the work here. Last time I was here I had to look it up, was on the 20th of February, 2006. I could not imagine it was that long ago, but it's funny to be back and really wonderful for me to have an opportunity to be here today. So I'm from Victoria, from Canada. Okay, now my clicker isn't working. So I'm going to ask you again to do your magic. I think maybe it's just. It just falls asleep. Is that what's happening? If I talk too long, it's going to fall asleep on me. And also, welcome also to the people in our Zoom, in our hybrid room. So I'm from Canada, and in Canada, we like to recognize the territory we are on. So I took the liberty of looking up the territory that we're on today. So Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga-Honohu, the Cayuga Nation. And the Cayuga-Honohu are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment, of course, of Cornell University in New York State in the United States of America. And by being here and offering you a territory recognition, I acknowledge the history of dispossession and honor and ongoing connection of the Cayuga-Honohu people, past, present, to the lands and these waters. And so why do we typically do a territory recognition? I always take a moment to reflect on why this is. We end up being where we are because of the situation that has brought us to this place. But if we recognize what has come before that we need to still deal with, we remind us all the time that this is historical injustices that haven't been resolved. So I'd like to take my moment to do that at this point. And I've spoken long enough that my clicker doesn't work anymore. It's going to be fun. Maybe I should ask you to say next slide and you can do your magic.
Yeah, I could do it for you.
Yeah, why not? I think every time I touch it, it's going to just fall asleep. All right. So the next little while is a few clicks, so you can go to the next slide. So I wanted to give you some background as to why we are looking at the topic of the geopolitics of the single market for financial services. And I've put up a few images that would give you a bit of insight into why we felt it was relevant to look at the geopolitics of the single market in finances today. And I have here a slide for you that has people you will recognize, I would hope, on the mural. And this is a mural with Trump and Boris Johnson. At the time, he was the leader of the Vote No or the Vote Leave campaign in the United Kingdom. And people seeing this mural may have thought that times are changing and that the fact that the UK potentially could be leaving the EU could be times suggesting that there is a breaking away of globalization or a times changing of alliances. But the fact that we have here Trump and Johnson together gives another element of an undermining of the international liberal order, because at the end of the day, Trump was also not that enthusiastic about the European Union or about multilateral arrangement that had been made, for example, in the area of trade. Next slide, please. Having said that, the international liberal order otherwise at this stage still may seem to have been in good shape. So again, coming from Canada, I offer you some photos here that relate to the EU and Canada. So on the left-hand side is the photo of the signing of the so-called CETA agreement. That's the Comprehensive Economic trade agreement that was between Canada on the one hand and the European Union on the other hand. The European Union obviously represented by two leaders because the European Union has an excess in presidents. This is the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. And Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, the political figurehead of Canada, signing an agreement on trade, which was considered one of the furthest advanced trade agreements between two advanced economies at that point in time. On the right-hand side, we see a similar team of people. We see, again, Tusk, who was also the other photo, still in his role of representing the European Council, but also at this place, they were trying to convince Trump to be focused on maintaining institutions like the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And there was a lot of sort of speak of how one dealt with Trump, who was trying to be difficult at this stage regarding international trade. Next. However, if we're fair, at the turn of the 2020s, so in this period running up to about 2020, the foundations of the international liberal order start to unravel. And I offer you here some political cartoons. On the left-hand side, we have a cartoon that focuses on a number of these trade agreements. So you can hardly see it from where you're sitting, but there's like name tags around these individuals on TTIP, which is the transatlantic trade agreement between the US and Europe, which didn't actually go very far, CETA, and then the TISA, that is the trade and services agreement. So these were being seen as examples of globalization gone too far by various civil society organizations. On the other hand, we have, again, on the right-hand side, a cartoon that speaks to concerns around investment trade, settlement agreements, and dispute resolution panels. And the question again about what this would do for labor and social relations, environment, and whether this is social dumping, and whether institutions and tribunals outside the regular legal system would then be ending up deciding on these matters. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the one that gives us really a moment to pause, and I mentioned to Patricia just as we started our talk up, that this is a period where we reflect on the fact that the full-scale war on Ukraine is now about a year old. And when this happened, people were still very shocked. I don't think many people admitted that they were preparing a full-scale war. There had been, of course, many grumblings before, even just before Christmas, in the 2021 Christmas, there was speak of, would there be Russian troops, etc. But the actual scale of the war took people by surprise. And it hasn't been going away. It has been going away, and it's not likely to be going away anytime soon. So the phenomenon of the Russian invasion and the features that it has, and also the brutality, casualties, even the casualties on the Russian side, has led a lot of people to think whether we're seeing a flip from the period prior to these various upheavals and the period that we are looking at right now. So is this a period of reorientation in the global political arena? Next slide, please. See, I can't talk long enough. Okay, so what I wanted to share with you today, therefore, is that we have, on the one hand, an increased geopoliticization of international economic relations. And we see with it a change to the international liberal order. And as I mentioned in the paper, I have a bit more work on this, and if you're interested in, I can speak to that more in more detail. I also have a slide coming down, but let's look a minute at some of the other features I haven't already shown in my picture. So we have the increased US-China rivalry. Again, it didn't only start with Trump, but also in the current time, we see much more positioning of both the US and China as not knowing how to read one another. It comes from both sides, right? Both the Chinese authorities have become much more geopolitically aware and signaling their leadership role in the globe. And the US has responded, or is also initiating, depending on what your point of departure is, with very strong language in positioning themselves. And we see this in all kinds of ways, whether it's about cell phone towers or forms of penetration in academia. There's many ways we could see this rivalry. I mentioned in my slide but more generally, reduced support for international trade agreements. So this transatlantic trade and investment partnership eventually collapsed after there had actually been some difficulties where Trump almost started a trade war. Juncker at the time, Commission President Juncker flew over and made sure to settle all rights, but then it didn't actually get resolved. So eventually it was silently said that this is pointless at this point to continue. We see grassroots opposition to judicialized forms of trade-related dispute resolutions, and growing concern about security and strategic interdependence on the economic side. Finally, we see please.
Mind answering a question?
No, not at all.
Could you say a little bit about what you mean by judicialized related?
Yeah, so the investment trade settlement system that's come together with CETA, for instance, is one of the main reasons why civil society groups were opposed to CETA. So the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU. And so it was in first instance not even so much the idea that you would have a trade. A lot of the trade barriers were already very low, so you would just finalize the remaining tariffs. But if there was a dispute, it could go to this court, and the court would be created only for this trade agreement, and 3 people would then settle a dispute. And the reason why grassroots society, civil society groups were really upset about this was that when you look at NAFTA, the North Atlantic Trade Agreement, there had been some disputes where these companies, particular companies, would take, for example, Canada to court over some regulations. And so they felt that giving the authority to these dispute settlement arrangements, that was one of the biggest issues. So they actually changed it a little bit in CETA when there was a lot of complaints, but the focus of the opposition focused on this sort of tribunal or this group of these dispute settlements arrangements. So that's what I refer to. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, just you can feel free to interrupt me if you wish at any time. Okay, thanks. Okay, so finally, the increased, this is what the paper also has a case on, the increased weaponization of economic interdependencies. So we've seen, not in the paper, but in a different paper, which I'm happy to send you if you wish, COVID-19 vaccines were heavily politicized. So the United Kingdom, for instance, would make sure that they got the vaccines before the EU. The EU was upset because they'd invested money in the development of the vaccine, and then the UK had actually negotiated better at Israel as well. So it became very politicized. We also see risks related to supply chain issues. So with COVID, we saw disruption of supply chains and whether it may be now necessary for countries, obviously the United States, but also Europe, to advance further industrial policies. In the EU context, industrial policy had been broken down, and it was considered sort of an area where if it started to look like state aid, it was unacceptable within the single market. But now, as there's a realization of the severe level of interdependence and how that could be disrupted if there are geopolitical tendencies or pressures, or if there is just a disruption because of supply chains, if boats aren't going, if a canal is broken down or whatever, that might be a challenge that now could be reconsidered. So also in the EU context, more focus on the need for maybe reinventing industrial policy. Next slide, please. So if we think about the evolution of the single market in finance, then this element of weaponization, we could consider what you would normally call geopolitical considerations. You could refer to this as geoeconomics, if you wish. And with geoeconomics, I would mean the definition as Blackwell and Harris have put it in a book in 2016, the systematic use of economic instruments to accomplish geopolitical objectives. And so what is an element here is also the consideration that it could be not a perfectly sort of cost-benefit analysis only on the economic side, but also for political and strategic considerations. And Damrau Eckert and Herant Sirales are talking about this as a geoeconomic term in the EU. So what I'm hoping to do today with you is to examine the so-called geoeconomics of the single market. and in second instance, explore when the EU acts like a sort of an actor in the international system on these geoeconomic considerations. So the time frame of the paper that were the case studies that we put in this paper are post 2008, so post international financial crisis, which already started in 2007, but it really blew up in 2008. And so our first case study looks at the EU-US regulatory tug of war in financial services. The second one looks at the Brexit negotiations. The third is the financial sanctions against Russia in the area of financial services and central banking. And then finally, we have a case that is not, it's not an actual case, it's a non-case, a case that hasn't yet happened, but we could imagine could happen, which might give a different perspective on things. And so these are case studies where the EU is one party and three other major powers are the other parties in these case studies. Next slide, please. So the first one I wanted to discuss with you is the EU single market. So just looking at the state of the art in the literature on the single market, maybe offer you a very brief history on the single market. Some of you may be more familiar, others might be less familiar. If we go back to the creation of the single market in the EU, it was part of what was called a creation of the common market in the 1960s, following the creation of the European Economic Community. And then after the customs union was created ahead of time in 1968, the next steps was to work on things like common agricultural policy and working on regional policy, all these kinds of things. But it was clear that the actual common market had not yet been fully established. And so by the time there is a bit of industrial decline and a lack of clarity what governments could do to get Europe back out of a really difficult period with high unemployment and lack of the integrated market, under the leadership of Jacques Delors, the idea was to complete the single market. And by the end of the 80s, the plan was to have the four freedoms, so freedoms in goods, services, labor, and capital, get established, and to do that by a deadline of the end of December 1992. And so that was basically what the single market was intended to do. It was a response to an internal decline and a realization that Europe was not really on level playing field with other players in the global economy. There was the rise of Japan, and there was obviously the US doing really well, and Europe was really having a hard time. So it was a response to a sort of crisis in the area of productivity and scattered forms of markets within the EU. So if we think about it in that sense, it's maybe not so surprising that many of the analyses focus on the internal dimension of the single market. A lot of scholarship focuses on, in the EU, was it a German model or a French model or an Italian model? And did we manage to get the best of all worlds? Has the market taken over too much? Does Europe have enough eye for social considerations or labor considerations? For example, President Darrow's request on judicialization, right? A very strong role for the European Court of Justice to ensure that there's a level playing field. And once the laws were made, the regulations and directives, people could take any state that was doing anything that would violate the four freedoms to courts, and then they would add to case law, which then further produced the creation of the single market, both on the side of the market, so freedom, as well as social regulation or labor regulation, or environmental regulation on the side of state steering. So that's what was happening in that time. So a lot of the literature focuses mostly on this internal dimension. So if you think about EU and the external dimension of the single market, we can see the EU as sort of external representation. So the single market is an element of how we look at the EU as being, on the one hand, a political dwarf, and on the other hand, an economic giant. And when people say that, they are often thinking about the fact that the EU has managed to achieve quite a bit in the area of internal market integration. I teach my students in Canada about the European Union, and I have to clarify that on some levels, the EU is more deeply integrated as a single market than is the Canadian market. So earlier iterations of trying to create a single market between, or the trade agreement between Canada and the EU, failed because the federal government cannot actually enforce a fully single market in Canada. So that's a hard imagination. But the EU managed to do this, among other things, through law and having the foundation in the treaty about the single market not being open to discussion and mutual interpretation. So in doing so, the EU has relatively strong market power. So it manages to use this size and its regulatory capacity to also have an impact on other players. So the EU also has then relatively focus on cohesiveness in the domains in which it has responsibility. Of course, it doesn't have responsibility on everything. Like indirect taxation is something that was able to be streamlined so that everybody works with the same indirect taxation through value-added tax and so on. But in direct taxation or corporate taxation, that's something that member states have their own responsibility. And therefore, the EU in the international context is relatively able to focus as one player in the area of trade, but is multiple players in the area of corporate law, for example. Finally, if we think about the EU as an actor, the way it has opportunity or capability or presence, the EU is able to focus on setting the agenda, often in areas of norms and in its values. It is less capable to act as a strategic player in the areas of military and defense, where member states still have a lot of their own responsibility. Next slide, please. So if we go to the terms of the literature, apologies for the slide being a little bit over congested, it should have been 2 slides. I mentioned already the weaponized economic interdependence, and there's literature that focuses on this. Carol Newman have written a piece that speaks this language to how economic interdependence can be used as a weapon, that is to provide access or not, and thereby closing off the market to other actors, for instance. And so in the literature on this, in this area of EU actorness and how economic, geoeconomic considerations can be taken into account, we see an interplay between domestic and international developments in the EU. And with domestic, we mean the EU internal and the EU external. And so when the EU uses its policies for geopolitical purposes, as for example, Sophie Meunier and Philippe Stiglitz have mentioned, they can do so also in the area of trade quite strategically. So that's what they're focused on. So if we then focus on this concept of geoeconomics, we would need to further narrow it down from the definition I provided you on the first slide, which was quite open. And we could then borrow from Kim a more narrowed down definition. And the definition there would be geoeconomics is distinguished from other economic strategies, not by the policy measures it employs, but rather by the ends it pursues. And these are often mid and longer term strategic goals. And so here we can also consider that it might be that you would have a geoeconomic measure taken that may not be mutually benefiting all parties, and it could even be that it on the short run doesn't necessarily give you the benefits you're looking for, but in the medium or long run could give you strategic benefits. So finally, I wanted to share with you those other 2 points. The literature on the sort of challenges of the international liberal order have been extensively discussed. For instance, in the special issue edited by Lake, Martin, and Risse in 2021, and a piece by Ickenberry that I mentioned already to you, Citero, on sort of looking at the international liberal order as not being a given. So this has been mentioned already in literature prior to the events that I even mentioned. Civil society organizations concerned with globalization come up with respect to these trade agreements. Next slide, please. So in order to look at this geoeconomics of the single market, we were wondering how we could look at this in a more systematic way. And so we felt that we would like to look at it on sort of 2 levels, on the sort of external or systemic level and the internal, domestic or EU level. So on the systemic level, we're seeing this evolution of the international economic political system, and in particular, the growing challenges to the liberal order. So the case studies that we're offering have some divergence there on this degree of challenge. And then on the internal level, one of the things we felt we wanted to look at was the development of the EU's ability to have policing capacity, for example, willingness, or the extent to which it's able to use the single market in financial services for geopolitical purposes. So systemic, at the higher level, domestic, EU level, and we see either an increasing, a more serious form of challenge versus a slightly less. And on the domestic level, we can have more integration or more coherence and more ability, or we can have less abilities or more split ideas or not clarity or don't have the policy capacity. So those are the levels that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So in order to kind of give this a little bit more flavor so that we can speak about something, we borrow four strategies from ancient military jargon. So we have a sword and shield, so to kind of protect yourself. The tertus, where you have all the protection so that you're a bubble. The phalanx, where you have the bubble, but you also attack. And then scattered commandos, where everybody's doing their own thing. So you see those come back later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So here are the example of the sword and shield. You get the image that goes with that. Second one, the testudo. So you can see the group, the commandos on the inside, the turtle formation. Third one is the phalanx, where you have that protection, but also the attack from the back. And the final one is the scattered commandos, so they're all over the place. I got the images, we'll get those back when we go to the final slide. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so our case selection. So this was a hard one, because we felt in sort of the qualitative case studies research, you always have to pick your cases very carefully. And as we were working on this, we realized that there's going to be a lot of stuff going on. We came down on asking our cases to require that they be focused on the US, so in the area of financial services, just after the period of the post-financial crisis, there was a lot of need to re-regulate or decide on regulation. There's a lot of interaction with the US. The next one is the UK, when the Brexit happens, and the question of how is the EU going to respond to the UK, and how coherent is the EU? Is the EU powerful? Is it able to put its mind to it? And finally, the one where we have the establishment of the real challenge to the international level, or in the case of Russia. So they are in a sort of a temporal order, but we've seen already instances of geoeconomic single market even in earlier times. So this is the focus we're on. People asked us whether we wanted to do the external role of the euro, but we decided that's outside of the realm. But if you want me to speak to that, happy to address that if you wish at some point in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So, okay, let's go to the case studies that I prepared for you today. I've seen I might have to wrap up a little faster than I thought, because we start a little bit late, but 5 minutes longer. Okay, so the first case is the EU-US tug of war after 2008. So as I mentioned already, the EU and the US looked at the state of the international financial crisis and realized that it was going to be important to re-regulate. One of the concerns had been that maybe there had been too much deregulation, and the result was that the financial system could blow up. And so the question then became, who's going to set these international standards? And it ended up being a tug of war because there were moments where the US was very well regulated in a certain area and had long reputation and had strength. And there were areas where the EU was relatively strong. And so what we see was those areas in which the EU already had a bit of capacity, it could set the agenda. In the areas where the EU was weak and the US was strong, the US would set the agenda. But when the EU was split, and this happens a lot in areas of financial services where the UK is very strong, UK of course still an element of the EU, you could see that the EU was unable to be coherent, and then even though they may have had a reasonable amount of regulation in the EU, if they were split, then they weren't able to pull it off. So we see that the EU is able to have some ability to deploy its market power, but it is less so when it is internally divided, in which case the UK would side with the US and then undermine the ability of the EU to set the rules. Next slide, please. So the case of the EU and the UK. So when the UK decides to leave the EU, when Brexit happens, the referendum in 2016, everybody is speculating what exactly is going to happen with the way in which member states relate to the UK. Not everybody has the same amount of trade. If you look at where the interactions are, countries who are very close to the UK, Germany, Netherlands, France, have much stronger ties to the UK than countries, let's say Poland or Austria or Italy. They have some relations, but not as intense. So it could have easily happened that different member states would have had different opinions about how the relations would need to be in the UK. Furthermore, as we saw on our previous slide, the UK had a very dominant position in sort of financial clearing and international financial transactions. So how would that have happened? But as the time unfolded, the EU managed to keep a united front. The single market remained intact. Core freedoms were considered indivisible, and it was not going to be a sector-by-sector approach, so giving finance a break, for example. So the EU managed to remain a bloc and required the UK to accept EU terms. Next slide, please. This slide I put in for the colleague of Fabian asking about Brexit. So if one is thinking today that Brexit was inevitable and there was no other way in the world but that particular Brexit, you will come home cold thinking that that's not actually what we're seeing. So the slide's a little bit small, but this is the poll of polls done by YouGov, and they poll very regularly whether people today feel that the decision for Brexit was the right decision. And you see basically that on the whole, people were not in favor of Brexit, and there's two intersections where they were more or less in favor. And that was during the Brexit referendum and when the UK actually left the EU. In all other times, more people think that Brexit was not a great idea. And now we have a really large split, the biggest split we've seen in a long time. So this is politically also very interesting what will happen with that. I'm not going to speculate on that today, but it is something that I thought would be worth mentioning because people are always interested in Brexit, not strictly speaking the topic I want to discuss. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third case is the EU-Russia case, so the weaponization of the single market in finance. And I gave you here a slide with Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, as well as Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, who's at the moment no longer the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, well known at the moment, currently Prime Minister of Italy. These two were masterminds behind the package that was made. Next slide, please. So they were both former chairs of the central bank, but also a very prominent position in G7 countries. So what happened in the case of EU-Russia, we see the weaponization of the single market for finance in a way that we haven't seen before. So the EU manages to decide to really deploy the single markets for this particular sort of outbreak of the full-scale war. So it adopts financial sanctions against Russia, so it freezes the accounts of the Russian central bank through European central banks, not only the ECB, but also national central banks hold accounts. The Russian central bank has money in accounts, and so they block that. They block Russian banks from the so-called SWIFT messaging system. They prohibit EU central security depositories to hold accounts of Russian clients and to sell euro-denominated securities to Russian clients. And they limit sale, for example, of EU citizenship to Russia, which was quite common still, in particular in countries like Malta and Cyprus, the smaller member states in the Mediterranean. And all of this was done in coordination with the group of 7 countries, the G7 countries, so Canada, Italy, Germany, France, and so on. So next slide, please. Now, the fourth case hasn't actually happened. It's a counterfactual case that we're thinking about. That would be if down the road, the idea of the sort of unified EU falls apart. Like the one that we had a minute ago, that was all, everybody was in agreement. But it is possible that down the road, particularly if the price of gas goes up very high, we see a lot of societal opposition right now to inflation, cost of life, cost of living prices, and possibly if the war further escalates, citizens might say, here we are putting in all our sort of our pension money, our wages, our houses are getting too expensive, everything is difficult, and elites are not able to manage this crisis. It's been going on for a year, and when is it going to go away? Maybe there's going to be an involvement of other former Soviet republics. So this is not a crisis that is as of yet completely gone. And within the EU, you can imagine that not everybody's on the same page, right? We have Hungary that is in frontal attack with the EU on a number of issues to do with the rule of law. And there's been quite a number of messaging in media about Hungary not being quite as motivated as the other member states on the matter of sanctions against Russia. So this, if there's going to be a bit of a fallout there, you could imagine that the EU could be in more in the scattered commandos, kind of say, we're really doing the wrong thing. The second part that you can think about is if we think about the financial market, in the single market in financial services, the single market is one thing. So that's, you can use as the EU. But the moment it's going to be in a differentiated area, I'm not going to talk about euro, but if you could imagine that the banking union gets involved and not everybody's in the banking union, would you then have some members of the EU involved, others not? And so you could imagine that this could unravel a bit if not everybody's on the same page. Next slide, please. So if we take these empirical findings and we put them schematically, I mentioned to you at the EU level with internal divisions and internal unity, and then we have the international level, which is a bit hard to read. So major challenges to the liberal order and a little bit less so. So the little bit less to the liberal order would be just after 2008, where everybody still has accepted that capitalism is not undermined by the crisis. It's been a really big crisis, but everybody goes back to their assumption that the international liberal order in principle is already kicking. And the same thing with Brexit. It comes at a time that people are starting to think about the world changing, but it's not yet happening. And my intention with giving you the Brexit slide is that it wasn't as if the UK people are fundamentally against the EU. It just happened that at that moment in time, a Brexit choice was made. But it wasn't like, oh, they were already asking to be out of the EU forever, and the majority of everybody all the time. No. So the Brexit moment was a moment, and we talked before I started my talk about Trump, right? Trump was also a similar type of moment, right? It wasn't inevitable, like everybody always wanting this. It was a moment in time, and it could have gone in a couple of ways. And so at that 2016 moment, we see some hint at challenges to the international liberal order, but we don't see a full-fledged one. And I would argue that now with the Russian invasion, Russian invasion in Ukraine, we see much more of a major challenge to the international liberal order, because of course it comes on top of all these other little things that have been happening before. So I placed the 4 cases in each of the quadrants. So the first case I talked about, transatlantic regulatory disputes after 2008, is in the internal division. So you get the UK, US, EU, not always on the same plane, and you have a minor amount of challenge to international liberal order. The Brexit one is an example where the EU is unified, but we have also minor challenges to the liberal order. Then we have the financial sanctions against Russia. At this point in time, the EU is unified, and there's a major challenge. And then this hypothetical case could be if the EU is split, and we have the same major challenge. Next slide, please. So this is why you needed the picture, so you can see that these 4 different ways of looking at it. So the sword and shield, where there's a protection, and the testudo, where they protect but they're not attacking, and the scattered commandos and the phalanx. This is the part where we have the armies that are protecting but also attacking as a whole. That's the image that comes to mind that the EU is using in its geopolitical actions. 5 slides, please. Okay, so wrapping up. So today's presentation was to focus on the geoeconomics of the single market, to look at instances of EU geoeconomic activeness. And so what we've seen that within the limited challenges of the international liberal order, the EU used single market in finance as a sort of shield and sword case in the transnational regulatory disputes, and in the testudos of an allied effective form in the case of Brexit. And then if you have, in cases where there's this major challenge, the EU's used this sort of phalanx, being connected and also attacking, but there could be a risk of sort of scattered commandos if the unity dissipates. So in final conclusion, the geoeconomic turn of the single market in finance and the strengthening of EU geopolitical actors has occurred over time. Thank you very much for your attention. the back and then over here.
What's your sense on what's gonna happen with the EU? Get stronger, get weaker? I don't know if those are the most sensible
Yeah.
terms.
So I've thought about this question a fair bit because in every crisis, this is always the question, is a crisis going to make the EU stronger or weaker? And the consensus is when there is a crisis, the EU, on the one hand, gets stronger because the reason for the EU becomes clearer. On the other hand, if they can't unite the views, it weakens because it can't respond with a strong answer. So the irony of the last crisis, the Russian crisis, is that the EU is suddenly strong in defense. It's been very weak in defense for the entire Cold War period and post-Cold War period because it was borrowing defense reputation from the United States. But with the challenges in the international order, the United States has also very strongly signaled that they're not going to be the security for the EU forever, and that it's really time for the EU to step up and do it. That has been very difficult because the leading country in the EU in terms of its economic might is Germany. And Germany didn't want to be a very active military player outside of its borders. And now with this challenge that we're seeing now, it's sort of a tipping point for Germany to say, okay, I think we can now do this. And so they've been investing way more than before. And there's now actually talk of a European defense in a proper way. So that's a major step forward, so to say, towards deeper integration directly related to the crisis that we've seen before us.
Thank you.
This was a 4-course meal, and I'm not sure I continue with that book. I'm not sure I've been able to digest it all yet. So let me follow up on the last question about our current situation. It seems to me that there may be so many conjunctural factors, situational factors in our current situation that I'm worried about it being fit into a typological analysis. For example, the United States and the EU seem to have very, very similar objectives. That's not always the case. Shown. The Eastern countries, so-called Bucharest group, are not only united in their fear of Russia, but they also are much closer than usual to the Western powers, partly with the exception of Hungary. So we have so many situational factors in this third box that I worry about your ability to fit it into typological analysis, which by definition limits the number of variables. So I guess my question is more about the way you and your collaborator are structuring these different cases. To extend my metaphor, it may be more than a 4-course meal. It may be a meal with many, many variations. It may be a smorgasbord. To give my Northern European example, it may be a smorgasbord where you really need to dig into one of these cases and find out what the ancillary variables are.
So yeah, thank you very much for that observation. I started off taking on the assignment with my collaborator to think at a very high level about what it might mean to say that one might weaponize the single market. And in fact, in my journey of seeing if I could say something sensible, I reread a lot of work that I read during my PhD about the creation of the single market in the 1980s and 90s, and all of the works that I have cited but I haven't really read properly. And it was a fantastic exercise to do because you could see how, in fact, in the 1980s and 90s, we were captured by the paradigm of the time. And obviously, we can only say that today we're again captured by the paradigm of the time when we're looking at it again. But I think it's nice to have an exercise sometimes at a super high level of analysis to kind of clear it out. And that it probably will not fully fit is I think fair. And one of the reasons to put in the fourth case, which I didn't promise in the abstract, but I said, Tricia, was we have an empty box. And so people always ask if you could typology in an empty box, what's in the box, right? And so I thought to myself, well, the box is the one we don't want to talk about. It's the one that was actually the question. Like, when is the EU going to collapse? Right? Because the ultimate box 4, the one that is hypothetical, is not just scattered commandos, is everybody abandoning ship and taking the hell out of there, right? So that could also happen, that people say, EU, forget it. But that's so negative, I don't like that idea. And I also don't see a lot of evidence that the EU is collapsing. I do see a lot of quarreling in the EU about how deep, how wide, who, you have to be firm on the rules, which rules. So I think there's much more actual empirical cases in disagreement to some extent, but it's, in my view, not existential. And therefore the scattered commandos seem a better metaphor for the hypothetical case where in this world in which we are now maybe finding ourselves, that's heavily challenging international liberal order, will the EU stick together when a challenge is presented? But I agree with you. In fact, the reason why I also took the trouble to give publicity to my colleague is she wrote a whole book on that case, the first case, and some of it has moved beyond the case that she studied. So each of those cases, in fact, are individual books that you could study. And the case of the Russian crisis, we've already 2 other papers independent of this that actually look at it properly. So I'm in full agreement that it's very much scratching the surface, but our goal is to clarify that we may see a more geoeconomic behavior on the part of the EU and trying to see if we can trace it and find evidence for it and to label it and say, when do we call it that? Under what circumstances, what would it look like? And to help us think at a higher level.
Yes, thank you, Amy. My name is Isabel and that was really interesting talk. And I actually want to pick up on something that you just mentioned about your research process, and because I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on historical intentionality. So the extent to which this was kind of part of the whole idea in the first place. And I think there's sort of, you could make the argument that the founding fathers very much had this mind long term, right? Let's create a single market, sort of protect in the sort of spirit of the liberal order that protects the union and importantly gives it international market power, such that longer term it could act as a geoeconomic. And then sort of there's like a lot of irony in that because it's sort of protecting the liberal order, and trying to promote that, but also very much trying to coordinate a sort of response in the general market. But then I think there's also another way of reading kind of history and saying, well, this is actually a very unintended consequence. This maybe was not part of what the original vision was, that it's maybe become more weaponized than anybody ever expected. And I'd just be curious to know how you think about this, sort of think about what the current behavior of the union in these various spheres, and whether or not that in fact is or is not part of its design.
Thanks very much for the question. So I realized I should have brought more books because my first big study was my PhD, obviously, as happens to scholars. And mine was on single currency. So the creation of economic and monetary union, and it was still being made. And I looked at perceptions of economic and monetary union in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And I interviewed people who were trade unionists, employers organizations, central banks, Ministry of Finance, and a number of other scattered sort of bankers and so on, other kinds of people, to see what they thought this EMU thing was going to do. And I was worried that, for instance, the trade unions, that they would be not having their own opinion, or that maybe they would be not seeing this for what I thought it was, maybe more integration, more globalization, would they be strong enough and so on. And so what was interesting is that there wasn't really one vision. and this is the single currency, it's not exactly the same thing as the market. But the vision that they had was their own positionality relative to what they see around them. So to take the example of the unions had just been made much less powerful over the 1980s by strategic action, by the manufacturer, for instance, very strategically, but also by people becoming less a member of a trade union, which then made them officially less representative of the voice of labor. And in a number of places, the institutions have become more sidelined in a number of places, so there's more space for the market. So trade unions came to this, we're losing power. We want to make sure we are part of this new thing. And although we feel that it's a regime shift that will not be excellent for us, if we do nothing, it's also not excellent for us. So we'll be part of this and influence it and make sure that social things are part of the design. And the employers or the people representing the industry, they also thought that it was important that it would not be a race to the bottom for standards, but that there would be reasonable standards, but not the high standards that they could fear if all Northern European standards were at all times in the market. So they also said, well, this will be better for us. And so even though they also had reservations, on the whole, they thought it fit their vision. And they realized that the market was needed because they couldn't compete outside. And at the levels of the central banks and the ministries of finance, the central bankers, they were worried that that they couldn't produce the market they wanted. And for example, the French, they right away were geopolitical about it. They thought, okay, we're going to compete with the US. And the Germans, this was totally not the topic. They were just trying to make sure that the regime they liked was implemented and not some other regime they didn't like. But they weren't thinking externally. And the UK wasn't going to be part of this at all, but they wanted to make sure that the others wouldn't produce something that they would hate to join one day if they changed their mind and wanted to join. So they wanted it as narrow as possible. And so if one looks at that case that I know really well and move it to the single market, we see similar results. I studied Decker, who was the person involved in the Roundtable of Industrialists. I looked at his biography, and he was the chairperson of Philips, the electronics company in the Netherlands. And they had this notion that the market was completely all over the place, and it required more unification and a more market-oriented place. And whether or not that would one day challenge everybody else, that was assuming they would actually be able to settle the differences. So that could be like an icing on the cake down the road, but mostly trying to focus on it right here and now. So I think the answer to your question is that some people may have thought beyond the page, and they could have imagined this. Other people were just not going there. But if you're Germany, the war is more recent and the future is very far away. And now the war is more far away and the future is recent. So it's easier to also change your opinion. But the French didn't have this problem. They were thinking big already. And the goal was keeping the Brits out because they didn't like it, right? So that was a very different mindset, depending on who you were and where you are. So I would argue they could not do the future because they were doing the present. But some of them already knew what the future might be. But before you can actually produce the market, there is no future. I think that would be my answer.
So I thank you for that interesting talk. I actually have a lot of questions, but I can still ask you some over dinner. So the first is actually kind of what characteristics do you think, let's say, economic cases do have to make the EU act as a unified actor, or kind of basically all of them splitting up? So what do you see when you look at those case studies? What kind of cases lead to unified speaking in that case? The other one is related to Isabel's question. I mean, like the whole single market idea started as a if states trade with each other, they don't go to war with each other. So there's this peace idea behind that historically. And it became a success story economically. And the further we were from the Second World War, the less people thought about the peace thing, and that the EU has brought us peace for years in the single market because of that. It just became an economic thing. So states have a little bit forgotten about that. So that has moved away from that. And then it was a success story for a long time. Then Brexit happened. People in France, like Marie Le Pen, were threatening with Brexit, which would have been the end of the EU. That is possible. And people say that maybe the EU has failed and they never achieved more than being an economic actor, but not unified in any other area. And so maybe we need a Europe of multi-speed or two speeds and all that kind of stuff. So in which direction do you see the EU going? Into that multi-speed, two-speed direction where there's more core integration and the rest is, we've also seen that with the euro and the economic crisis in the EU and the refugee crisis where they could not agree on certain things. And many suggested if the EU wants to move on, they need to go at different levels of speed.
Yeah, so there's a course meal kind of question. So I hope I remember them all, and if I forgot them, then ask it again. So let me start off with the question of where your first question. So where did the EU come from, and is it still a peace project, right? And I think it is fair to say that because of the peace project, it was possible to do the economic union. Because you remember all the other ones failed, right? The coal and steel community was also supposed to be bigger, and there was no defense union. It's all coal and steel, very technical, nobody understands. It doesn't seem very relevant, but that was possible, very functionalist in that sense, right? And atomic energy, nobody understands, few people understand that, so that's okay. And the economic union was also relatively technical because it didn't do all the important redistributive things, which people care about, right? It doesn't give you child benefit, it doesn't give you unemployment benefit, it doesn't give you money for schools and so on. So it's sort of like, it's very technical, right? It's like products and safety, whatever you're doing in the labor market would be with respect to the markets. Right? And so it remains the domain of lawyers. And that makes it very difficult to politicize. And so as long as that project sort of works, it doesn't need to draw the attention of the citizens other than the peace project. And I think people did realize that. But there, in fact, if you think about it, it had a lot of American influence too. Right? The Marshall Plan was part of it. The US was only willing to give the money to integrate it and so on. So strangely enough, it's not an internal peace project only of the EU, but it was also the vision that the allies gave to Europe and said, you do this or else we won't give you money. Right? So it served a number of goals. But I think it's fair to say that by the time the EU was really mature, which I think I'm not exactly sure when that really was. We had it with the customs union being complete in '68. That was one element with the fights over who was member. The UK was not yet in, Denmark as well. So once they were in, we had crisis in the '70s with the oil and prices, wood prices, all of that. That was particularly good. Then we have the end of the '70s where we have to celebrate 25 years. 25 years of the EU at the time still, nobody was extremely happy. And so then they reinvent the EU to kind of become a more serious single market. I think we are happy, so to say, around about the same time as the fall of the wall, which is again serendipitous, back to the question about aren't we seeing a lot of things at the same time? Because the actual feeling that things are going great, Japan comes crashing down, the Cold War ends, Germany unifies, whoa, right? And what we see is the citizens of France almost vote no on the matter treaty. So we're happy, but we're not really happy. They don't want to be in there, and they ask all kinds. So despite the things going really well, we still have something not so well, right? So that we see that.
Maybe we're happy on the level, but never on the level of the citizens.
Well, the citizens were never taken along. During this whole project, the citizens were sort of we don't need to talk to the citizens because it's an elite project. And by the time the master treaty comes around, it has to become a project of the citizens. But the citizens haven't learned about it in school, don't know why it's relevant, all of that. So you have to start, they're all immigrants into the EU, have no clue, right? And that's the same time when we discover that we're going to produce EU citizenship. We're going to have Schengen eventually come into the EU, that wasn't there yet. So people are going to travel freely. They're going to have a single market actually on labor. Not just I go to Germany to be in the Max Planck Institute, and the first thing I have to do get all kinds of stamps and documents because a Dutch citizen goes to Germany and stuff to do a week of documentation. I mean, what single market, right? So I mean, the notion of what it means starts to be produced from Maastricht onwards, not before. It's not. I mean, there's a handful of people going to Erasmus. Okay? So I think that's a people's project that has to happen, and with that, obviously, come opposition because it's a democracy. If everybody loves it, it's all democracy. And somebody's making something up, right? So you will need to have people also opposing and then have that whole process streamlined. And I think what we saw in the post financial crisis period, there was a real fear that this severe disruption of the international system, which has led to such high recession in most countries, that would be a sign that the elites have taken the citizens on a ride and they didn't actually give back. And in that period, we also see high sort of anti-Europe votes, Eurosceptics, etc. And then in the 2019 elections, the fear was that it would be even higher. But at that point, we saw a much more mainstreaming of opposition. And so the question today becomes, is the mainstreaming sort of within the establishment, or is it counter-establishment? Is it society disrupting, or is it within the acceptable range of what you see in democracy? And I think as we go into this second year of the full-scale Russian war on Ukraine, these questions will become very important. We see much more anti-conspiracy or anti-establishment things, conspiracy theory people, and that becomes much more prevalent. And that could also have a major disruption on the EU. So long answer to your questions. I think we're as elites, as political leaders, as opinion makers, more and more attention has to be spent on sort of education, making sure people understand why this is done, clarify the reasons, be honest on trade-offs, and be much more aware of the need to kind of give back. That it's not only something in the very long run, but that in the short run, it's also visible what the EU does for us.
So I'm just wondering how likely that fourth is this sort of vision of support for stands of people. You mentioned Hungary, and certainly there's opposition to this. But other than that, and Hungary is a very hard. For this one, on Russia, they have Poland on their side, they have the US on their side. We'll see what happens to China still, might help Russia with weapons, but on the other hand, their economy is faltering, want to make friends with EU. And they can't just make friends with Hungary because it's not a big enough market. So, I'm just wondering, and then there's other areas of, I guess, agreement or for the globalization that are, competition policy that we talk about a lot, where we more and more aligned to regulating practice. So should we be hopeful?
Thank you. I indicated my likely scenario for that fourth box being related to the war continuing and costing a lot. So as we see the anniversary that is happening this week come by, it will raise the questions about what does everybody want to do to end the war? Because if everything is going to be the same as it is, it's a possibility this will be a protracted period, an extended period of war. And if it's where it is now, I think people who are not over there might think that they can sort of cope with this, like Ukrainian refugees come, lots of people die. Maybe people can cope with that. Maybe they're used to it. It's a terrible idea, but maybe. But if there is a shift, so we don't want this anymore, we want to actually end it, what would you do? Like what? I'm not a strategist. I don't know any military, whatever. Despite the metaphors, I have no expertise in defense. I do not know how to do this. But if one just academically thinks about options in warfare, you could actually make it worse to end it, or you find other ways, right? So the EU has been involved in sanctions, but what all the sanction research suggests it's a long run thing. It doesn't happen to actually stop a war, because a war is made of different things than a sanction can ever do. So it would always need to be to combine with other things. And if combined with other things means a heavier military conflict, it comes with possible repercussions, right? It can come with repercussions on cost of living, food, energy, etc. But also a possible, God forbid, likely possibility of an escalation of a size that we don't know what it might mean, right? So the biggest arsenal on nuclear weapons I think 90% of them are in either the United States or Russia. And just this week, Putin has said that he's no longer accepting the terms of the atomic energy, atomic weapons. So we're coming into a new terrain. And so how important is stopping this war for everybody in Europe? So not just for the Hungarian authority, but also for citizens. And so they may or may not agree with their leaders. And if you get people massively disagreeing with leaders, then leaders won't have very strong positions. So that's one part of the equation. And what if the EU is perfectly happy to stay on one focus, and the US and the EU are one, but China supports Russia? Now, where is that going to go? So this whole geopolitical shift of where are these blocks, and are we going to see another Cold or warm war, and is this a proxy war? All of that people will have different opinions on. And that's if it all stays in Ukraine. What if Russia then decides to go to Moldova, right? This last week and weeks ago, we have the Moldovan government stepping down, a new government there. There's been an oligarch who's been trying to very low level protests, but it makes people very nervous. Is this going to be an attack on Moldova? Is it going to be like maybe on the land, or is it going to be inside, taking out the government, putting in the Russians more favorable? And then how will Europeans know how to assess Moldova? They've had zero interest in the country for decades. So it's a challenging one, right? So if something happens in Moldova, is everybody going to say, yeah, exactly the same as Ukraine? I would say so. Elites would say so, with the citizens, right? And at what cost? So yeah, I think the bigger political picture of what this is has so many tentacles that it's not unthinkable that at some point again, I mean, we have the government of Italy. We don't have a colleague here present today, but the government of Italy is led by Giorgia Meloni, who's a politician who's in theory a little bit more sympathetic to sort of more authoritarian regimes, etc. So those kinds of things may shake things up a bit. I mean, in France, we just had presidential elections, but everybody's holding on to their seat to see which way that went. So a lot of little things could change how the overall perspective would be. On the whole, I'm positive though, but I think it's tricky times. Do we know questions from the room?